Hey, Jan, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I'll read a little bio just so everyone who's watching or listening or reading along knows who you are. You've been a developer and startup entrepreneur for the last 20 years, and most recently you were the co-founding CTO at Reverb.com, where you ran technology and infrastructure from 2012 to 2018. And today you're focused on Bitcoin education and consulting for early stage startups. And you write on Bitcoin at yanpritzker.com, and you're also the author of Inventing Bitcoin, which is a great book, and you can get that at inventingbitcoin.com. So, how was that for a summary? Pretty good?
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Love it.
Yeah, so I'm curious sort of the transition that you had from being CTO at Reverb.com into the Bitcoin world and how that went for you, and sort of what was the appeal to you, and what was your sort of onboarding process like into
Sure.
becoming a Bitcoiner?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually knew about Bitcoin in 2011. I first read about it on Slashdot, and I never really investigated it. I didn't like pay attention. I heard that it was some kind of payment system or something. I didn't really know. I ended up buying some, I think around $30, which was the top of that bubble. And then I watched it go all the way down to $2 and basically thought, okay, this is some kind of joke. It doesn't really matter. And then I either sold or lost the keys to those coins around the $2 mark. And so at that point, I forgot about Bitcoin and just kind of kept working on startups. And then in 2013, heard about it again. This time I saw Coinbase, and it was much nicer, much shinier than Mt. Gox. So I figured, okay, there's some development in the ecosystem. This is maybe a serious thing. But again, I didn't actually research it or understand what it was, and just bought some. Again, and around the peak of the bubble, about $1,000. Again, watched it go down to about 200. So that was the bottom of that bubble. And again, forgot about it. So two cycles I lived through and completely forgot about it. And I was busy with Reverb. I was working on that. And around 2016, I actually got interested in Bitcoin again, and it was in the media. But more importantly, it was because my cousin, he was working for Microsoft blockchain strategy at the time. They were actually talking. He came to me and said, hey, you should look at Ethereum. We're looking into this. It's really interesting. And I started asking people about it, and everybody was kind of excited, had heard about it. Less people were like kind of interested, at least in my circle, more developers. So a lot of people just telling me that was something interesting. I looked at it, saw that it was an interesting value proposition for developers, and then I started remembering that and started hearing like that Ethereum was somehow connected to Bitcoin. I started researching it. So around 2016, I basically started watching every Andreas Antonopoulos video I could get my hands on. And as soon as I started doing that, I just fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And I realized how important this invention was and how silly I was not to have understood it back in 2011 and not have had the time to really understand what it was about. It took me about a year, I think, from 2016 to 2017 to fully appreciate Bitcoin. During that time, we were going through a massive bull run. There was all this, ICO stuff happening. There was Ethereum. There was all these altcoins. So there's a lot of noise. And for somebody who was new to the ecosystem, it wasn't immediately obvious to me that Bitcoin was king, the most important thing to be looking at. And it actually took me a while because I came from a technology background, right? And because of that, I was the first looked at the very interesting technology stuff. Like Ethereum seems very shiny on the outside, right? If you look at the marketing, if you look at the some of the code examples that they give you, how you can build a bank in 100 lines of code, that looks very interesting. But Bitcoin is a lot more subtle. Bitcoin is an economic phenomenon, I think, almost first and foremost. And until I understood the money aspect of it, which took like a year of education, that I really, really kind of get really excited about it.
Well, I'm curious, what was the tricky part of the money aspect of it that took you a while to really get?
I think, like many people, I don't question what most people go around using their dollar bills, not really thinking about it. Unlike a lot of Americans, I do have a little bit of an alternate experience because I came from the former Soviet Union. So I actually moved to the States when I was 7 years old. And in the former Soviet Union, we had a highly centrally controlled economy where the government was setting the prices for everything.
Water reminder.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
Notification.
Okay. We had a tightly controlled central economy. We had the government essentially abusing the printing press. The ruble was devalued by factors of 100 and 1,000 many times over. And the other interesting thing about that is that when we left the Soviet Union, we were not able to keep our money. It was illegal to own U.S. dollars. It was legal to own foreign currency. It was considered speculation, and speculation was illegal. So you were forced into using this government currency, which was constantly devalued and couldn't buy you anything. So when we left the government that actually allowed us worth of currency per person, we exchanged the rubles for the U.S. dollars, and that's what we left the country with, $400 in our pocket, because there's 4 of us in the family. So I was very familiar with the idea that governments control money. It wasn't until, that was when I was a kid, right? So I didn't think about it until much later. And when I got into Bitcoin, I started understanding, what does it actually mean for a government to control money, and what does it actually lead to? And then you start looking at things like the Soviet Union, things like Venezuela, places like China, which have extremely tight central control over their currency and their payment systems. And you start to see all the negative effects that has. And I'm not even talking about the stuff that happens in the United States with, inflation or whatever, because by and large, the United States is a responsible country when it comes to money. At least, out of all countries, we tend to be a bit more responsible. That's not to say our system is perfect, but having that background and finally looking at Bitcoin, that's what triggered it for me. I started understanding, okay, there are actually problems with the financial system. There are actually problems with the way that we consider money, because most people don't give it a second thought. When they go to the grocery store, they just, they use their dollars and they work, right? So most people don't think about it. But if you come from a broken economy, it's a bit more obvious once you start looking at Bitcoin and you see, hey, this is a thing that if we had had it in Russia, if we had had it in the former Soviet Union, we would have had this stash of wealth we could have taken with us, and we could have carried it in our heads, So that's where it kind of clicked for me.
Cool. And let's say I'm, Give Bitcoin is, a way for people to gift Bitcoin to people who may not be familiar with it. So if I'm role-playing someone who's new to that world and I just get this gift of Bitcoin, what do you think I need to know? What should be this sort of education process that goes along with it when someone's first sort of exposed to the realm of Bitcoin?
Well, for me, it was understanding why the claims around Bitcoin are credible. So some of the things that are said about Bitcoin are things like it is scarce in its supply. There's only 21 million Bitcoin. It is portable. It's not confiscatable. Like, you have privacy over your transactions. All of these things that are said about Bitcoin are not immediately obvious why they're true, right? Like, why are there only 21 million Bitcoins? Is it just a piece of code somewhere that somebody can go and change, and then there will be 22 million, right? So I think one of the first things to understand is kind of how Bitcoin works as compared to systems that you may be familiar with, right? And this is actually what I address in my book, because a lot of people are familiar with banks or mobile payments or something like that, but they don't really think about what actually happens when you send a payment from one phone to another. Is it money flying between phones? No, it's not, right? What's actually happening is that they're moving some numbers in a database somewhere, and that database is kept by your bank. So once you understand that, I think the next thing to ask is like, well, what if there wasn't any bank? That's Bitcoin, right? With Bitcoin, we democratize that process of moving those numbers around. Instead of happening in one place, it's now happening all over the world, and anybody can participate, right? Given that they're willing to burn money and burn energy in order to participate in the mining process, they can participate in writing things to the ledger. So I think one of the things is understanding why those claims about Bitcoin are true and how that system kind of functions.
And what do you think is the sort of curriculum that would go along? I know you also present to high school kids sometimes, so I imagine that's a similar sort of level of knowledge, or like someone who's new to what do you think someone in that realm actually needs to know? And like, if you were going to lay out sort of like, okay, here's what I think you should know first, and then learn this, and then if you want to know more, here's more of a deep dive. What do you think the unfolding process should be like for them?
Yeah, so I've given a few high school talks, and what's interesting about high schoolers is a lot of them haven't actually had experience with the real world economy yet. Mm-hmm. So a lot of them don't, even less than the average sort of adult, have thought about money at all. Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I like to go through is how money might have evolved. Now, we don't really know how money evolved exactly, because writing, some of our earliest writing basically is records of accounts. So we know that money pre-existed writing in some form. But we do have examples that we've seen in even relatively recent history of how money sort of evolved. And some of the things that I go through are examples from, for example, from Native America, how we had a system of using beads or shells that were turned into necklaces.
Mm-hmm.
And when the settlers arrived, the settlers being European settlers and having already had experienced money, they basically looked at these beads that the Native Americans were using sort of as collectibles, as displays of wealth or power, and they tried to turn them into money. And they did that by trading actual goods for those shells. So they started trading furs and other things that they needed. And then pretty soon they started to realize, hey, if we produce a lot of these shells, we could be rich. We could buy all the furs, right? And so the Europeans started mass producing a lot of these shells, and what that did to the value of the shells was it quickly destroyed the value of the shells. And then we also saw the same thing happen in Africa. So I show this to kids. I show them how European settlers came to Africa and noticing that the Africans were putting value in these glass beads, using their superior technology from Venice and Murano and stuff. They had glass-making technology. They came in. They were able to mass-produce beads in order to buy up the actual wealth being human capital, like slaves, right, and things like that. This is one of the biggest reasons why the African continent was actually exploited by the Europeans, was they were able to mass-produce these glass beads and become essentially wealthy because they printed the currency that was important. So these examples are the seeds of why scarcity in our money matters, right? If the money is constantly growing in supply, then the value of it is devalued, right? That's the reason we don't use grass or tree leaf clippings as money, because they're very easy to come by.
Right.
So once you plant that seed, you then start to ask the question, okay, well, we understand that shells or glass beads are very easy to mass produce. What kinds of things aren't, and what kinds of things make good money? And you look at the history of how money evolved, and you start to see, okay, all over the world, people started to look at metals, because metals are very hard to produce. They're hard to dig out of the ground. They were hard to turn into coins. Those things ended up being better money than seashells because they were much harder to inflate the supply of. And you start to see that evolution. And then I take people through to the modern day, right? Once we had gold and once we had gold coins, what happened to that? Well, people started putting that stuff into vaults, and they started issuing pieces of paper that represented a claim on that gold. And that's how we have some of our earliest paper currency. And in fact, early U.S. dollars, we have notices on them that say that you can redeem this dollar for a certain amount of gold, a certain weight of gold. And we see how that evolved, and then eventually we basically lose the ability to redeem our dollars for gold. In 1971, we end the convertibility of dollars to gold entirely for the entire world. And now the dollar becomes the gold, right? The dollar becomes the thing that everybody wants all over the world. That becomes a store of value that we have. And it's the best one that we have today because there's nothing, the United States basically controls the world economy there. And for that reason, potentially, they are actually relatively reasonable with the amount of new dollars that they produce every year, even though a lot of people will take issue with that. But I think that's a good learning experience to understand why early money didn't work in the form of shells and beads, and why coins worked, and then how the dollar came to be the thing that represents that gold, and eventually became just something that represents value without any actual metal or anything scarce backing it. And then we see, going forward into the future, what are the ramifications of that? Well, one of them is sometimes governments mismanage their money supply, and we see that in all over the world, where goods are scarce, but money is printed in order to subsidize people or whatever, and all of a sudden you have hyperinflation. So you see those problems, and then you sort of tie those back to, well, what does Bitcoin do for us there? It gives us a different kind of money. It gives us a money that doesn't have those problems. Nobody can control the supply of it. I think we can all agree that, in America especially, we really like our government in a sense because it's decentralized. It has checks and balances, right? The judiciary and the legislative and the executive branch, they all check each other. But who checks the money printing, right? Theoretically, there should be some independence there, but in practice, we see that doesn't really happen. We see that there's a lot of influence from government on the money, on the central banks. So once you start to see that, you see that there's abuses that are possible, and they happen a lot in other places, but they're also happening here at home in the United States and other places as well. So I think understanding monetary history is the first bit that I explain to high school students, and I do this in a half an hour talk. So in 15 minutes, I like to go through understanding how money evolved to the dollar today, and then I want to talk about what are the problems with the money that we have today. So the first one is the printing of it is under human control. Whenever there's humans involved, there are always mistakes that can be made, right? There's always greed that comes into play. There's always kinds of, things that can go wrong there. Secondly, now that we have digital payment systems, we are eliminating the idea that people can transact privately entirely. So nobody can, you can go and buy something on the street for $1, but more and more all over the world, cash is being eliminated. And this is actually something that I was very made aware of by the talk called Currency Wars by Andreas, which I everybody watch, where he goes through examples all over the world of how the governments are eliminating cash in favor of digital systems. Now, digital systems, like in China, we have WeChat, and people do a lot of payments through that, including in completely remote regions where there are no banks. People exchange value on this app. Now, that's extremely convenient, and it allows for an economy to function without, on a global scale, without a lot of necessarily a lot of banking infrastructure. But the downside to that is that every payment is now monitored by the government. Every payment is now censorable, right? And so if they want to see what dissidents are doing, they can now see that very easily. They can see, okay, there's a bunch of people paying for train tickets to go to Hong Kong to protest. Let's stop that. Let's prevent people from buying train tickets. This is a very dystopian future. Now, I don't think it's going to happen in America, but it's all really up to us in terms of who we elect and the laws that we allow to pass, right? And if we allow a payment system to become completely centralized and completely monitored by the government, we do run the risk of ending up with some kind of totalitarian in charge who wants to abuse that system in order to control what people can or cannot do. And we already have examples of it today. I mean, you can't, like, for example, if you want to go and buy cannabis in a state where cannabis is perfectly legal, well, the cannabis shop can't actually process credit cards because they're not allowed by federal law to do so. So we already have a black market using cash there. And so if cash is eliminated, what happens to all these sort of, fringe use cases that basically give people their freedom? So I think identifying some of those problems is the next step to understanding why Bitcoin is necessary.
And I'm curious, is there any, as far as like taxation or things like that, is there an argument for why the government should be sort of knowing the transactions that are happening? Is there societal costs at all if everyone's able to just sort of have their own system of money that they're doing without the government knowing about it?
Well, tax payments, I'm not like a hardcore libertarian that thinks all taxation is theft. I do think government is too large, and it can definitely be shrunk a lot. But let's be clear, we've always had cash payments, and tax payments are basically voluntary, right? You're always sort of under threat of being audited. But, can you tell me with complete honesty that you've paid taxes on every single dollar you've received, like selling lemonade on the street, like with your kids? I don't think a lot of people can answer that question honestly and, not go to jail. So the reality is there's always some amount of sort of skirting the law on the fringes, but by and large people pay their taxes, and more importantly, companies and the people who create all the economic activities, they pay their taxes, right? I don't think it's that relevant that you bought a coffee for $10 and then somebody didn't report that. Now, I'm not advocating breaking the law, but that's the reality of the situation. We've always had cash, and we've always had people not reporting those cash transactions.
Sure.
So if Bitcoin is a new type of cash, then that may continue to happen. Now, will it happen more or less is probably the question. I don't know. The thing is, Bitcoin is a transparent ledger, right? We have a record of every payment. So unless you keep a squeaky clean digital trail, eventually, if somebody really wants to, they're going to find out what you've done. So I think by and large, most people are law-abiding citizens. They want to do the right thing, at least according to the current laws, and they're going to continue to pay their taxes in the way that they have. And partially it's because they're law-abiding, partially maybe it's the threat of the government coming after them. But I don't see that changing very much with Bitcoin. It's just, I don't think Bitcoin makes more people into criminals than they would have been otherwise, in other words. You know what I mean?
Sure.
A lot of people will say Bitcoin is being used for crime, but if you look at it, the percentage of Bitcoin that is assumed to be used for crime is falling all the time, and I think eventually it will approximate, the same as done with cash, because there's only a certain percentage of the world that is willing to be a criminal, right? Just because you have a different payment system doesn't make you more or less of a criminal. That's my take on it.
Okay.
Of course, that's speculative, so I don't know.
All right. Okay, so we've got sort of like the history of money as sort of step one, and then sort of here's this more decentralized way that sort of is a better system, I guess maybe you would say. What do you think is the next thing that people who are exposed to this world kind of need to know about?
Yeah, so the next thing that I talk about, and again, I approach it a little bit differently because a lot of people will say there's two angles to Bitcoin education. One is how do you use it, right? How do you set up a wallet? How do you store it securely? All of that. I actually don't look at that until people understand what Bitcoin is, because I think it's kind of important to understand what it is you're getting into. You start from just the day-to-day usage aspect of it.
Can you say that again?
You really miss out.
You were cutting out.
Sorry, yeah. I was saying if you start from the practical end and explain to people like Bitcoin is money, you store it in a wallet and you can run that wallet on your mobile phone or on your desktop. You can skip a lot of stuff about Bitcoin by doing that, but I don't think people then understand or value the Bitcoin as much because they don't understand what the purpose of it is. If the purpose of it is just to get rich, then that's a totally different thing than understanding that it's a new type of monetary system that's censorship resistant, that's going to help us safeguard us against things like Venezuela. It's going to help us prevent the next Soviet Union from happening. It's going to help prevent totalitarian states from having undue influence over their citizens. Like, that's the stuff that's really important. So I don't start with education of how wallets work. I start with how Bitcoin works. So the way that is, look at how a normal payment goes, right? We have a payment from point A to point B, and that payment is all about contacting a third party, which is a bank, whether that bank be PayPal or Apple Pay or a Chase Bank, it doesn't matter. All banks are effectively the same things, they're just databases, right? In this modern digital world, we don't really use cash as much. We basically just contact our bank and we say, bank, move money from account A to account B. And what the bank does is they debit one account and they credit another account. And what does the bank do to secure that? Well, they have guards. They have security guards that guard it with physical means as well as digital means. They have things that check the databases and have audits, and they have all kinds of ways to find out if somebody's intruded into the system. So a bank is essentially just a glorified database with some guards around it. So we need to reproduce the same system in Bitcoin. Now, the way that we do it is we first take that ledger that the bank has where it says how much everybody owns, and we decentralize it. We distribute it. We give it to everybody. So we say that anybody who wants to can download a copy of the bank's ledger. That's the first step of Bitcoin, right? So we now have everybody who wants to participate just downloads a copy of the ledger. The next thing we say is, okay, well, in the bank system, we have to contact the bank in order to move money from account A to account B. In Bitcoin, we don't have anybody to contact, so who do we contact? Well, the answer is we contact everybody. We use a broadcast system. So instead of contacting the bank, we're going to tell everybody on the network, everybody who's connected to the Bitcoin machine, tell them, hey, everybody, we're moving money from point A to point B. My name is Alice. I'm moving money from Alice's account to Bob's account. So now we have a system where everybody has a ledger, and now we have a secondary way. We have a second layer, which is to be able to move that money by telling everybody to do it, and everybody goes ahead and writes that entry to the ledger. So now we have a distributed ledger. Everybody's got sort of the ability to write to it. Now the next question we ask is like, well, okay, if everybody's writing to it, how do we know that everybody's keeping it honest? How do we know that somebody isn't going to go ahead and cheat and put in their own, change their own balance and everything like that? And so what we come up with, and in the book I kind of go through a few things leading up to this, but in the interest of time, we come up with a lottery system. Okay, a lottery system allows one person in the world, we choose somebody at random in the world to be able to write these things into the ledger. The benefit of that is that anybody at all can participate, right? We want to have an open system. We don't want to be able to choose who gets to write this ledger, because if we do that, then those people are always under threat of being attacked in some fashion. So we want to make sure that we have a completely random system. We can choose anybody in the world. So we come up with a lottery system. And that lottery, how do we make sure that people can buy tickets to the lottery? How do we know that they win? Well, this is kind of the biggest sort of innovation of Bitcoin. And that is that instead of having a central authority that you buy these lottery tickets from in order to participate to write to the ledger, you buy the tickets from the universe by burning energy. So when you burn a bit of energy, that's a lottery ticket. That's proof to the rest of the people in the network that you have expended some cost in order to play the lottery. And the way that they do this proof is through a bit of funky math that we call hashing. And hashing is something similar to throwing random dice and trying to hit a number on a very, very large number line. So you're burning a little bit of energy in order to... Oh, I think I've disconnected.
No, I still got you. I think I can hear you. You hear me?
Hi.
I can hear you.
Sorry about that, I dropped out there.
No worries.
Okay, so this is a bit challenging to explain without diagrams, but
you're doing a good job.
The idea is
we can always put in images later in the transcript if we want.
Yeah, totally. So the idea is we're going to burn some energy in order to play a lottery, and then we're going to prove to everybody else that we actually burned this energy. And the way that works is there's something called a hash function, where we essentially, it takes some data and it smashes it together and produces a very, very large number. And we have a number line from 0 to as many as there are atoms in the universe. So we have a huge range of possibilities. And we're trying to hit a very, very small area on that number line. So every time we burn our energy, that allows us to throw this die and get a random number and hit a certain spot on this number line. And then when we do that, when we found a number that hits that certain spot, we announce it to the rest of the network and we say, look, this is what I've done. I've burned this amount of energy. I've produced this number, and this is where that number falls on the number line. And this proves that I have burned sufficient energy to write to the Bitcoin ledger. Now, there's more to that than I'm saying, but that's just the fundamental idea. The fundamental idea is we're allowing anybody to participate in the lottery by burning energy. And what that does is it creates, Nick Szabo had a great term for this, which is called unforgeable costliness. It creates a certain cost.
What was the term?
Unforgeable costliness.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is an idea that money, in order to be money, it has to be very difficult to produce, right? Again, if we had tree leaves as our money, then you can just go and shake a tree and you get a whole bunch of money. That's not good, right? That makes that money very easy to forge, very easy to create. And so we need something that makes that money scarce, and what Bitcoin uses for that is energy, right? We know that energy is a scarce resource in the universe in the sense that you can't just make it out of thin air. It's the first law of thermodynamics: energy can't be created or destroyed. So you actually have to convert that energy into Bitcoin. That costs you actual money, and that creates a certain cost to produce Bitcoin, to produce ledger entries in this Bitcoin ledger, and that makes it very difficult for you to cheat. Because if you were to produce something that wasn't actually Bitcoin, right, that didn't follow the rules of Bitcoin, then everybody else on the network would not accept your lottery number, and essentially you will have burned all this energy and spent all this cost and not produce anything of value. So it's not good if you just go and dig a hole and try to sell somebody a bunch of dirt. You need to dig a hole and find a piece of gold. So that's what Bitcoin is. It's about doing all this work, but then producing something that's valid by the rules of Bitcoin, meaning you produce a Bitcoin that is within the 21 million supply limit and follows the schedule of issuance and follows all the other rules of Bitcoin, and only then will everybody else then take your entry and write it into their database.
And I'm curious, just the mentions of burning energy, I feel like to a lot of people that's like, oh, well, that sounds wasteful and not environmentally friendly. Is that the kind of burning energy we're talking about, or how do you frame that in a way that people understand?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think that one thing that we have to understand, and this is it gets a little bit into advanced Bitcoin topics, but the way that Bitcoin works is it doesn't have to be difficult to produce. To want some cost to produce. Is that cost a waste, right? Well,
sorry, you were cutting out again. Can you start that answer over again?
Yeah, the answer is the cost to produce Bitcoin a waste? Well, one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? So one thing that I've read recently is that running Christmas lights for the week of Christmas in the United States burns as much energy as the entire Bitcoin network does.
Really?
So Now, if I had to choose between having a sound, uncensorable, and seizable money and not having Christmas lights, I know I would choose the money. So it's really a question of what is that energy being used for, right, in comparison to what? Gold mining is also extremely wasteful and also expends a lot more energy than Bitcoin. Gold mining is also extremely, polluting to the environment. And the majority of gold that we have, and a lot of people say, well, gold is used in dentistry and electronics, but the reality is the majority of the gold is dug up and then stored in vaults and used as money, not as a store of value, not as electronics or fillings. So we have a lot of waste in the world. Now, the other thing I would say is the waste, the quote-unquote waste, is actually a lot better in Bitcoin than it is in a lot of other places because Bitcoin has something called a difficulty adjustment. What that means is that Bitcoin is always creating a competition between all miners, which are the people who are able to write to the ledger. That competition is about efficiency. Only the most efficient operations will produce a Bitcoin. So if you have 10 miners today, they're all mining Bitcoin. Tomorrow we have 10 more miners. Now we have twice as many miners, right? What that will do is people will start producing Bitcoin twice as fast. But we don't want that. Bitcoin has a very specific rule about how much Bitcoin can be produced per unit of time. So in order to enforce this rule, Bitcoin has a difficulty adjustment. And what that means is that the more miners come on, the more the difficulty increases in order to slow down the production of Bitcoin. And if miners drop out, then Bitcoin production will be sped up by the difficulty being decreased. So there's constantly this equilibrium. What that means is that if miners operate in an environment where their energy is expensive, so let's say I start to mine Bitcoin here in Chicago in my home, and my energy costs 10 cents a kilowatt. If I'm burning that energy at 10 cents a kilowatt, and some other miner has it at 4 cents a kilowatt because they're operating in some remote region of Iceland on a waterfall on hydro, well, they're going to mine a lot more Bitcoin than me, and eventually the difficulty adjustment will make it so that I become unprofitable. And so the problem there, or not the problem, this is actually really good, is Bitcoin over time forces out the inefficient miners. It forces anybody on expensive electricity out of the system because they will become unprofitable. They will go out of business, they will have to shut down their miner. So what does that mean is that we have a drive towards the cheapest possible electricity anywhere in the world. And what that means is that Bitcoin over time pushes people to things that are cheaper electricity, which is renewables. And so today we have a lot of governments that subsidize things like coal or gas or natural resources like that. But in reality, if we allow people to develop technology freely, then they will end up using renewable energy like hydro much more, right? And this is what we're seeing with Bitcoin. Actually, there's a report from a company called CoinShares, which has indicated with some research that they believe that as much as 74% of the Bitcoin network is powered by renewable energy, which is huge, right, compared to normal industries that use 16 or 17% renewables. So Bitcoin over time will become more and more renewable, and it's my belief that in order to become competitive, miners will eventually have to become the electricity producers, because that's going to be the cheapest way to get electricity is produce it at the source. If you're not producing it here, you're paying extra for it to get transmitted to you. So we're going to see vertical integration between energy producers or miners, and we're going to see this happen in the most remote possible places where energy isn't otherwise being used in any other way. So it's not really a waste in that sense.
Yeah, it sounds like another way of Bitcoin eliminating the middleman, but just on energy.
Exactly. Right, because I've tweeted this before that right now a lot of renewable research is government funded. Governments are subsidizing renewables because they want to encourage a greener this or that. But the reality is those subsidies are not sustainable, and they will go away one day. And they're funded by taxpayers or by printing more money. So with Bitcoin, you have this very interesting capitalistic free market incentive. If you can find a cheaper way to produce energy, you will be able to print more money. You will be able to print more Bitcoin, right? And so there's this drive to constantly look for cheaper and cheaper sources of energy, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just to push back a little bit, like cheaper forms of energy sometimes aren't always the most environmentally friendly. Like would this lead to fracking, or things like that are maybe cheaper, but in the long run more damaging to the environment?
Maybe, but I think I'm not an energy expert, but with fracking, we're still dealing with gases that are trapped underground and things like that. Whereas solar or hydro or something like that, it's much more like abundant, So I think that over time, with better technology, we will see those things take off simply because the abundance of that energy is higher. But again, I'm not an expert, so I don't want to speak out of my field of expertise.
Fair enough.
But the point is, even if it doesn't change from what it is today, it's still significantly more renewable than any other industry. And then on top of that, like I said, even if this was all coal-driven, then it's just a question of, well, what would you rather spend it on, Christmas lights or Bitcoin or some other thing, right? There are plenty of other things that are quote-unquote wasteful from somebody's perspective.
Gotcha. I want to go back a little bit because I thought it was interesting when you were talking about sort of avoiding discussions about wallets and how to spend Bitcoin and focusing more on the philosophy and the history of it a little bit. Because that sounds like it ties in a little bit with like GiveBitcoin and the time lock that's involved. So people receiving a Bitcoin, but it's not something that they can spend right away. It almost seems like it incentivizes people to learn about it in a more depthful manner than they would if it was just like, okay, I got this gift, how do I spend it right now?
Yeah, and I think the truth is that we're still very early in the adoption of Bitcoin as a money, and so most people aren't really even looking to spend it, right? And it would be silly to spend Bitcoin today if we actually think that the end goal is for it to become a global money. Even if the end goal is for it to become, say, a replacement for gold to store value, then there's $7 trillion worth of gold out there, and there's not even 200 billion worth of Bitcoin. So it would be silly to spend that money today on anything but extremely relevant purchases, like you need to buy a house or something and you have no other way to pay for it other than Bitcoin. Fine. But at this point, it is a speculative asset. It's something that people are holding in hopes for it to become this kind of global money. Whether it's a replacement for gold or something even bigger than that, we don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's just too early. So I think right now the importance is to understand why we have Bitcoin. In my opinion, personally, I'm very long. My vision for Bitcoin is very long time scale. I'm thinking it's something for my kids. I'm thinking it's something even for my grandkids. I mean, I'm not thinking that Bitcoin. It may go up in price quite a lot in the next decade, but I'm not thinking that it becomes a world money within the next decade. Although there are people who will contradict me there. There's all kinds of people think we're going to have hyper Bitcoinization tomorrow, but in my opinion, there's a culture shift that needs to happen, and that culture shift is, this is something Jack Dorsey talked about on Marty Bent's podcast, which is kids need to be born with it as a normal, right? When kids today are born with iPads, then they see any screen that doesn't react to touch and they think it's broken, right? That's a culture shift. That's a shift of expectations. And so when a kid is born with Bitcoin, they have Bitcoin from an early age. They know how it works. Then they grow up, and then they're like 16. And Andreas Antonopoulos said this had a great speech about this. They're 16. They're allowed to open their first bank account. They walk into a bank, and they've already been using Bitcoin for say 6 to 7 years, and now they're told about all these crazy things like the bank is closed at certain hours, or it takes a week for it to go to their friend in a different country, and like these things are the things that sound completely foreign when you have Bitcoin. So that culture shift is a generational shift. It doesn't happen with us. It doesn't happen with people our age. It happens with our kids, people who are growing up, the children of Venezuelans. It's not the Venezuelans now that are in poverty, can't afford to buy Bitcoin. It's their children who are going to grow up with the stories of what happened to their parents' economy, and they're going to be able to pass on those learnings, and they're the ones that are going to actually adopt it as money. So it's way too early. I mean, this is 25 years out at minimum, in my opinion.
Okay. And to go back to, I feel like we've got the framework for curriculum building here, a little bit of the history of money, how decentralization helps. Then we have sort of mining and how it actually works. What do you think is the next thing then that would be good for people to know who are just new to this world?
So yeah, after mining, I think it's good to understand how. I think at that point you can kind of start to talk about how these systems actually work in practice. And so thinking about how accounts work, right? So in a traditional banking system, you have an account with the bank. They store your cash. They give you a digital representation of it. And then when you want to spend it, you have to contact the bank. You have to give them your identity, which is your username and password, or your PIN code, or whatever it is that identifies you. And then you're able to spend that money. Now with Bitcoin, the way that works is we don't have identities. And this is a really important understanding that helps us kind of understand some of these issues that we have with the financial system. We have Equifax that lost 140 million Americans worth of data. Capital One just got hacked. 100 million people's worth of data stolen. So that's the stuff that Bitcoin also attempts to solve by not having these sort of honeypots of information. So what does Bitcoin do? Well, we don't have accounts in the traditional sense because we don't have a bank, so we have nobody to actually contact and register with and give them our name. Instead, we allow people to generate accounts by essentially creating a very large random number. And this is similar to the idea of mining, where we're playing this lottery, but with accounts, we can just generate a number, and that number becomes our account, and we can generate as many of those as we want. And so that's what we call a Bitcoin address. We generate a special kind of key, and that key allows us to sign for transactions from that account, just like we sign a check, or just like we give the bank our username and password. We end up signing the transaction and saying that I have the authority to move this Bitcoin. But the interesting thing is we do that without actually telling anybody who we are. So I don't tell the Bitcoin network that I'm Yan and I'm moving my money. What I'm saying is I have generated this address. People have sent me Bitcoins to this address, and now I can sign a transaction because I have the key that controls this address. And all of that is done on my computer or on my mobile phone. And that's how the Bitcoin account system works. So instead of having accounts, we have these stored arbitrarily at will, and we have something called a wallet, which is a piece of software and runs on our mobile phone, or it runs on our desktop, or it could be a piece of hardware, it could be a piece of paper. There's a lot of different implementations of this idea, but all it does is it allows us to store these keys and these signatures and to be able to sign for the transactions from the account. So that's one of the next things that I cover, because I think it's important to understand how that differs from the traditional banking system, and then how you actually go about getting Bitcoin is that you're not actually storing that Bitcoin on your phone or on your computer. What you're storing are the keys, which is the rights to be able to move that Bitcoin and transact with it and spend it later.
Interesting. Okay. And then continuing along this path of a curriculum, is that, are we reaching sort of a endpoint for where you bring newbies, or where do you think we go from there?
This is generally where this is kind of where I like to set them up with some Bitcoin on their phone. I usually have people download a wallet and send them a little bit of Bitcoin, because that helps them, first of all, just feel it out and see how that works. And I think that's where the mission of GiveBitcoin is really great, because that's exactly what we're aiming for, is to be able to give some Bitcoin to somebody. I actually gifted some Bitcoin to my sister for her wedding, and she still has it. Now, the trick there is when you gift Bitcoin to somebody that's new to it, is they have to understand the ways that we back up this information, right? Because with Bitcoin, unlike a bank or a credit card or something, where if something goes wrong, you can call up your institution and say, I've been hacked and somebody stole my funds. Which is, in a credit card situation, that's very true. In banks, it's less true, but some degree, we have some protections there. With Bitcoin, you are essentially your own bank. You have your keys, and you need to make sure that you don't lose them. So what I did actually, when I gifted Bitcoin, is I actually took a backup of her key. So I'm essentially a trusted party. Now, this is my sister. I'm not going to steal her Bitcoins, but I could if I wanted to. Right. So there's a problem. There's a problem there with Bitcoin, because if you know somebody's key, you have complete control over their money. It's just like knowing the login to their bank account. But there's also a big problem with newbies in terms of understanding how to secure and store their keys. And I think we're at a point where there's a lot of companies coming up with cool solutions for this that are making it easier. And I'm really bullish on that. I'm hoping that we see more innovation there. I've been looking at some of this stuff. I mean, there's things like Unchained Capital, where they're creating a multi-sig solution. Multi-signature meaning you can have multiple keys, and if you lose one of them, then it's no big deal, because they'll have your backup. There's also one other thing that I played with a little bit called Casa Keymaster, where they basically create keys and they split them up and they magically back them up into places for you. There's a bit more magic and trust involved there, so I'm not 100% loving it, but the user experience is very good, because for a user, they no longer have to think about how to back up their keys. They just kind of boot up this app and it stores their stuff for them. I think we're going to see an evolution in this space over the next 5 years, and it's going to be a dramatic improvement in how newbies are onboarded because they will be able to store their keys safely and not worry about them as much. But I think today it's still quite a bit of education about, like, you need to write down this phrase, or put it on a piece of paper, or store it on your computer somewhere. Of course, that's dangerous because somebody could hack it, but people need ways to back things up.
Sure. Yeah, it feels like, I mean, part of the challenge even we're facing with like putting together a curriculum is you're giving someone a gift and they're receiving it. How do you make it feel not like a homework assignment? Like that, okay, you've received something that's good, not that it's like, okay, now you have to become an expert in this whole, technology and finance world that you're not familiar with, and learn how to back stuff up, kind of like.
I agree. We're asking a lot of people, but the thing is, we're just too early. And again, that's my feeling, is that the earliest ways to send email were also very cumbersome. You had to log into a server. It was like a terminal screen, and it was only for geeks, right? It wasn't like your grandma was sending email. And it wasn't really until Gmail and large-scale hosted email services that we were able to make email something that people felt natural about. So I do think there's a bit of a culture shift thing there, where right now we're explaining to people what Bitcoin is. In the future, what we're hoping for is that when people grow up, it's not what is Bitcoin, it's what is money. And Bitcoin is money, right? So that's just the money that everybody uses. You're no longer asking those more deep questions like, well, why does scarcity matter? We're in a situation where we're transitioning from the legacy financial system to this new thing, and maybe it's not even a transition, maybe it's an addition, right? It's possible that the legacy system remains intact, and this ends up being this kind of side pocket of just a way to have some wealth that's not confiscatable and kind of a check on government authority. That would be nice, and maybe that's what will happen. But the hope is that the culture shift comes where people no longer need to be educated about what Bitcoin is. But as long as, it's just a passage of time. So today it's going to be a fair amount of reading, a fair amount of understanding, and videos or whatever it is, until you're really comfortable with the idea of what is it that you just received.
Yeah, it also seems like there's sort of a catching up process of, like you're mentioning, like just interface stuff and sort of backing up keys and technology, that there's going to be sort of a whole economy and sort of different companies working out a lot of these points of friction that exist.
And we're seeing extremely rapid development there. I think that's one of the coolest things about Bitcoin, is that it's totally permissionless. So with your Banks app, you don't see a lot of changes in your Banks app because it's produced by one company and they don't have a ton of incentive to make it better. Whereas with Bitcoin, it really is just a free market, and if you want to make a better wallet, just go for it. And so anybody who's making better wallets, better backup solutions, they stand to make a lot of money by being first movers in the space, and we're seeing a lot of competition there. So that's very exciting, and I think we're going to see the pace of innovation be just way faster than we've seen in traditional banking because of that.
Gotcha. So I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and ask you maybe a little bit more of a philosophical question about just learning about Bitcoin in general and appreciating it. How does it help people? Can it make you a better person or impact one's view on sort of saving and investing? What are the other sort of life benefits that come along with learning about Bitcoin and being exposed to it?
Yeah, so I would say that, having gone through the learning process myself, a couple things shifted for me. One is I became much more aware of how the economics, of the world work, how the banking system of the world works, which gives me, I think, a different perspective on sort of the things that I read, day to day. When you hear about, hyperinflation in Venezuela, or you're hearing about possible recession that's coming here, I think I have a better education about just life and how finances work in life in general, which is nice and it's interesting. The other thing is, I think when you hold Bitcoin and you do see the appreciation in price and the growth of the market, you do start to experience what some people have termed low time preference, which is something I learned about from reading Saifedean Ammous's book, The Bitcoin Standard, which I highly recommend. Something he talks a lot about is how money, he has this theory that money, the very money that we use, changes how we look at time, right? So if the money that I use is like hot potatoes and it's going to be worth nothing tomorrow, then my intention and my incentive is to spend it as soon as I can. And this is something that in economies like Venezuela, we see that for real, right? Because people don't even want the bolivars. So they're completely worthless. People are looking for US dollars. People are looking for currency that isn't going to be inflating on them, in the very next day, and it's not going to be turning into toilet paper. And so people are looking to spend that currency as soon as they get it into their hands and get that hold of the good stuff. So with Bitcoin, you start to experience some of this effect as well. And when you hold Bitcoin and you're about to spend money on something, you really think about it like, is it better if I spend this money on this trinket, or is it better if I put this money into Bitcoin and just wait? And I definitely experienced this actually in 2017 because I finally saved up enough money to buy my dream camera. Very expensive camera. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm a photographer. Dreamt all this life for this camera. I had this money, and I said, okay, you know what? Like, I can wait. I can wait another year or 6 months or a year. I'm just going to put this money into Bitcoin. Now, I was lucky that it was in the middle of a bull run, so that money actually did go up. But on a long enough time scale, it just changed my perspective of like what do we spend money on, right? And some of the things that Saifedean talks about is that with money that constantly loses value, you just want to spend it on stuff that's like a toy, some clothing that's gonna last you a month, some kind of poorly made goods. Whereas when you have money that is actually that holds its value over time, let alone goes up, but even if it just holds its value, you have an incentive to save, and you have an incentive to wait, and you have an incentive to spend it only on the things that you really need, which actually drives us to create better goods for society, things that last longer, things that are higher impact, make investments that are going to actually pay off, and not just throw our money into the wind, as a lot of people do. So that's his theory. I don't know if it's his theory or if it's just a general Austrian economics view, but the idea that an inflationary money encourages spending on frivolous things is very interesting, and I think I have experienced a bit of a mind shift with the Bitcoin coming into my life.
Interesting. And how about these high school kids that you present to? Do you sense a shift in them at all when they learn about Bitcoin? Does it help them evolve how they're thinking about money or savings?
I think so. I mean, a lot of kids are just, frankly, I've given talks here on the north side of Chicago where kids are quite sheltered and haven't had a lot of experience in the real world, even things like jobs or, like earning money, spending money. I mean, they spend their parents' money, I'm sure. But I think it does give them an appreciation of like how the monetary system works. A lot of them come away with it with new knowledge in terms of, oh, I didn't know that we used to have gold as a money and now we don't have that. Dollar's not backed by anything. Like these are things that people think about generally.
Right.
So that does change their perspective. The other thing I think that really does change their perspective, which I personally comment on, is when I show them examples from other countries where these things have gone horribly wrong. I show them a picture of Zimbabweans with a wheelbarrow full of cash. Show them a suitcase full of Venezuelan bolivars, which are now worth $5. And when you show them stuff like this, and they're like, "Have you heard of what's happening in Venezuela?" "Yeah, I heard there's some like revolution, some strife. Like what's happening?" Well, this is what's happening. Their money became worthless. Like they have these suitcases full of money that are worth nothing. And this really starts people to, the gears in their heads are turning about why did that happen? And how can that be prevented? And are we safe? Are we safe here in America from that happening? And why? Like, what makes us special? Or doesn't it, right? Or is it just all kind of the whim of the government? If the government starts to implement bad monetary policy, then that just affects everybody, right? So I think that kids are walking away with more questions, and I had some really good discussions with some of them after these lectures about asking all kinds of questions. They started to get really deep about, like, well, how does government work? How does money creation work? They start to ask these questions, which I don't think they've ever thought about. And, like, it leads you down some interesting rabbit holes.
Interesting. Okay, I got a couple more questions and then we can wrap up.
Cool. Totally.
I think one of the things that people seem to focus on is the volatility of Bitcoin and sort of the price swings. And I'm wondering, especially for someone who's like a new recipient of Bitcoin or new to that world, and how do you sort of frame that to people when they're like, oh, all I know is this, it has this massive spike and then a crash, and that's what they think it is?
Yeah, so what I used to say, and I still believe this is basically true, is that Bitcoin is still a very, very small market, right? So the amount of money that it takes to actually move the market up or down is relatively small. I mean, for somebody who's like a hedge fund who's got $100 million at their disposal, they can move the market quite significantly. So the bigger the market gets and the more liquidity that we have with Bitcoin, the less the volatility will be an issue, because It just will take a lot more money to move the market. The other thing I say is that we are very early. We are at a place where nobody really knows what the future of Bitcoin is, and it's kind of like, to use the colloquial phrase, zero or moon, right? It's either completely worthless because it won't deliver on the promises that we think it will, or if it does, then it may very well be the best money we've ever had as a human race. And if that's the case, then it's going to a very, very high value. And so what we're seeing now is these hype cycles where people all of a sudden think it's going to the moon and then it's going to zero, and so we're seeing more and more of these psychological hype cycles. But these cycles are possible by two things. One being the market is not very deep, so it's easy to manipulate, and two, the culture shift hasn't happened yet, right? Just like I said with the kids, 25 years from now, when everybody thinks Bitcoin is normal, we're not going to see people entering and leaving the Bitcoin market every day. They're just going to be using Bitcoin as an actual money. So they're going to have some money in their savings account, and it will be in the form of Bitcoin. It won't be in the form of US dollars necessarily. And when that's the case, we're not going to see the market fluctuate quite as much. But the other thing that I read recently and I thought was really, really cool, which was an article by Caitlin Long, where she said that the system we have today with central banks, it creates short-term smooth. It's not volatile in the short term, but there's systemic instability, right? So the trade-off is they stabilize the short term. So tomorrow I can spend my dollar, get an apple, and then the day afterwards I can spend my dollar and get an apple. And maybe a year from now I have to spend $1.02 to get my apple, but it's still relatively stable. But in exchange for that, we have systemic instability. We have the dot-com crash, we have 2008, we have what could possibly be the worst recession of our time that we're probably on the brink of right now. Like we have these things that are the result of manipulations of the currency market. Now with Bitcoin, it's completely flipped. We have extreme systemic stability. We know exactly the supply of Bitcoin. It cannot be changed. We know exactly, to the year 2140 or whatever, we know exactly how much Bitcoin will be produced. In exchange for that, we have no ability to have the supply react to demand. So if people want more Bitcoin, the price goes up like crazy. If people want less Bitcoin, the price goes down like crazy, because it's just people entering and leaving the market and the supply is not able to react. So I think that's an interesting trade-off that you make between should the system be stable or should the prices be stable? And you can't really have both, because in order to keep the price stable, then it assumes that the supply and demand are kind of matching each other. Whereas with Bitcoin, the supply is the supply. It cannot change, right? So we have this very interesting volatile system, but the volatility is a way for new people to enter the market. They get excited about the hypes, and the people who are not well educated, well, they sell their Bitcoin too early and then they suffer. So that's why it's important to educate people on the long-term value of what it is that we're really aiming for here.
Gotcha. And one other thing that you sort of pose in your book, this idea of how do I know, like blockchain sounds interesting, but how do I know Bitcoin won't be the MySpace of crypto, that there's some better version that's going to come along, and then I'll feel silly for having invested so much in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid question. It's very difficult to say that in the first 10 years of the technology. We're still quite early. But there are network effects, right? With MySpace and Facebook, which is probably the most common comparison I hear, is like, well, Facebook was able to beat MySpace in the span of a couple of years. The answer to that is with Facebook and MySpace, the moat was very small. It was just like everybody wanted to be on MySpace because their friends were there, and everybody wanted to be on Facebook. But the thing is, there's no real cost opening a Facebook account. So a couple of people tried it and they liked it, and a couple more people tried it and they liked it, and they were able to have accounts in both systems. And so they transitioned themselves slowly from MySpace to Facebook. And Facebook had a better user experience, so everybody kind of moved over there, and then they became more and more sticky. Now with Bitcoin and money in general, you can't do that, right? If your money is in Bitcoin, then it's not in some other coin. And you want to hold the money that is the most widely accepted, the most saleable, with the most liquid, right? So in other words, if you hold a coin that is only on one exchange versus the one that's on every exchange in the world that's acceptable in every country in the world, then you're kind of hurting yourself. You're hurting yourself by holding the one that you can't sell easily, the one that's going to change the price the most because it's a smaller market. And so there's a saying, liquidity begets liquidity. With Bitcoin, it's the most liquid coin. It has the most amount of economic activity, and so that just drives even more economic activity. And so anybody who says otherwise, who's like, well, I don't believe in Bitcoin, I'm going to buy, a marmot coin, well, then they're actively punishing themselves during the process of thinking that all this economic activity that's over here is going to all of a sudden move over to their coin. But that's just one of the network effects that it has, right? There's also the developers. It has kind of the best developers in the world working on it. And we've seen similar things happening in the open source world with things like Linux. Like, why aren't there 20 Linuxes, right? There's a lot of small offshoot projects, but Linux is Linux. The Linux kernel is the one that sort of won mind share, and all of the best developers in the world went there and they started developing on it. And then we see the same thing with Bitcoin. And anybody, again, who's trying to sort of compete with it, they need to steal those developers, or they need to grow their own developer ecosystem. Then we also have the effects of time, right? 10 years have passed since Bitcoin has been around. So during that time, Bitcoin has slowly grown. It was kind of ignored a lot of times in the early stages. People thought it was a joke. People didn't consider it. So it grew slowly and was able to attract the right growth of the ecosystem. And it was attacked, and it was survived those attacks, and it morphed. Now, anything new that's coming up today, it has to catch up to those 10 years that Bitcoin's been around. But there's no way to catch up to time, right? So they have to move faster in their development speed. They have to maybe create better features that are a lot better so that people will actually sell their Bitcoins for this new coin. But the thing is, what is the feature that people value the most about Bitcoin, right? The answer to that is it's scarcity. People value Bitcoin because it is scarce and because that scarcity is guaranteed. And that is not true of any other coin, because in order to compete with Bitcoin and to move faster than Bitcoin, they basically have to have some amount of centralization. They have to have a leader. They have to have a very fast-moving team, and a fast-moving team requires leadership. Bitcoin is extremely decentralized in the way that it is developed, and it's very difficult to change it. Without any other coin, I don't think you can really make that claim. It's very easy to start making changes to these coins, and we see them doing hard forks every year, which are basically backwards compatible changes, extremely disruptive to the ecosystem. We see these things happening that indicate a high degree of centralization. And so if we believe that the thing about Bitcoin that everybody values is its scarcity, and the credibility of that scarcity is backed up by decentralization, then it's very difficult to reproduce that exact sort of immaculate conception with the founder that's disappeared, with the slow adoption that happened under the radar. You can't have any of that today. I mean, any new coin, it's on center stage from day one. It's in the spotlight, and we've seen it time and time again. We've seen coins try to launch and duplicate a Bitcoin success, and they've all gone down very, very badly. So it's the market has spoken, right? To say otherwise is kind of ignoring 10 years of history at this point.
All right. And I know you recommend the Bitcoin Standard as a book. I'm wondering, is there any other books or people or podcasts where, especially sort of geared towards people who are new to this world, that you would recommend they check out?
Yeah, I actually think there's a big problem with podcasts for newbies. I do really like Stefan Livera's podcast, and more because that one covers a bit more on the economic side, and tends to be. Which podcast is that? I'm sorry, the Stefan Livera podcast.
Okay.
Stefan Livera's podcast is a bit more economic oriented, and it tends to be not as technically sort of geeky. Some of the other stuff. I also like What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormack, although that one he tends to have a lot of technical guests. So I don't think it's super friendly for newbies, and in general, I think there's sort of a lack of great short form, easy to understand content for newbies, and that's something that I'm actively working on as well. I do think that we need to improve the educational materials in the space. But yeah, Stefan Livera, Marty Bent is another really good one. Marty's podcast is a bit more current events, I would say. So it's like if you just want to know what's happening in the world, it's a good one to listen to. It helps you just keep up with the news. But it's a time commitment. A lot of these things are 1 hour type episodes. They're time commitments, and they're, I would say, more geared to people who are already in the space.
Yeah.
And it's quite challenging to find something that's for newbies. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Is there anything you don't think we covered that you think would be? I know there's a ton we didn't cover, but anything you think within the?
There's always more to the Bitcoin rabbit hole.
I'm sure.
I would say just Twitter is another good place to hang out if you're new to the space. Actually, in my book at the end, I have a Twitter follower list, which I might turn into an actual. I should probably turn into an actual Twitter list, but. Bitcoin Twitter isn't all of Bitcoin, but it does give you a good sense of what's happening in the space and what people are working on, which is cool to see. yeah, the other thing I would say is everybody needs to just chill out a bit and not expect this to happen overnight, because it's going to be a long haul adventure. We need to strap in, we need to educate folks, and we need to make things a lot simpler, because I think any good product, it's not just education is really just one aspect of it. The product has to be self-explanatory. So we're not at that phase yet. I don't think there's really great wallets out there that are self-explanatory. They're getting better, but they're not there. So we need to get to a point where people can open up an app and have a complete onboarding experience where they understand everything, and they don't need to be into the rabbit hole. Hopefully GiveBitcoin will do that, but I think that it's just going to be an effort that takes some time.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a great chat. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate it, man.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.